In this last video, I'm going to go over how to construct a two-sample t-interval. Again, this is just a confidence interval, and then I'm going to go over one problem showing you how we can construct it. Now, much like the confidence intervals for a mean and proportion, we start with our sample in the middle. The parameter that we're interested in is the difference between these two averages. So we're going to use our sample averages to construct the difference between those two groups. Then we're going to reach up and down some margin of error. Again, our margin of error is just some critical value times the standard error. Our standard error is the same that I showed you in the previous video. We're constructing it based on the standard deviation of the two samples as well as the sample size of the two samples. Again, I want to emphasize that the book constructs its confidence intervals in a slightly different manner, pooling together the standard deviations of the two samples. For most problems, these two methods are going to reach an approximately equivalent standard error. But if you're finding that you have large rounding errors, double check that it may be the method that you're using, and let me know. Once you've calculated your standard error, the last value you need is your critical t. Remember, your critical t comes from that t-table. Once you have your degrees of freedom specified, you can figure out the critical t for the given confidence level that you've determined. So let's try a problem so you can see how these confidence intervals are constructed. In this, we're comparing two different TV programs. What researchers want to know is if the program you're watching affects your ability to remember the brands that are advertised in the commercial. So they show two different TV programs with 9 commercial breaks in between the program. Afterwards, they ask people if they can remember the brands, and they record that. So for program A, you can think of this as Game of Thrones, let's say. The average number of brands recalled is 1.01 brands. For program B, let's say this is Silicon Valley, the average number of brands remembered is 3.55. There's also a standard deviation because some people remembered more, some people remembered less, but they sampled 110 people for each program for a total of 220 people that participated in this study. We want to construct a 95% confidence interval to see if there's a difference in these two programs. So the way that we construct this confidence interval is starting with our sample averages. Here I've just put the sample average for program A first and subtracted off the average for program B. That's going to give me a negative value. I'm then going to reach up and down some margin of error. The margin of error includes my critical t and the standard error, where the standard error is calculated as the square root, accounting for the standard deviation of both of the groups, as well as the sample sizes. Now to find the critical t, I go back to my t-tables. Here, I want a 95% confidence interval. So the confidence column that I should go to is 0.975. That's going to give me a 95% confidence interval. My degrees of freedom is 218. Remember, I had 220 observations. If I subtract off 2, then I will have my degrees of freedom. You can see there's no 218 on this, so I'll just go ahead and use infinity for my answer, or for my critical t. So that's how I got 1.96 in the construction of this. You can see that the lower bound and the upper bound have negative values in them. Because both our lower bound and our upper bound are negative, this implies that our true difference is negative. Remember, for a two proportions test, we examined whether or not 0 was in the interval. We'll do the same thing for a two sample means test. We examine whether or not 0 is in the interval. Because 0 is not in the interval, then we can say there is a difference between these two groups. We can even say which one is greater. In this instance, because we put program B second, then it must be that program B viewers remember more ads. This is, again, because we have a completely negative interval. So our difference must be negative. And because our program B is greater, that's what makes it a negative difference. So that's how you construct a confidence interval for the difference between two means. Remember that your interpretation very much depends upon whether or not 0 is in that interval. If 0 is in the interval you construct, then you can't say that there is a difference between the two groups. But if your interval is completely positive, that means whichever group you put first has a greater average. Whereas if your interval is completely negative, whatever you put second has a greater average. Again, I'll put a handout on ReggieNet regarding how you can perform this confidence interval using your TI calculator. If you have any questions regarding how the standard error is constructed, please let me know.